in my head and picturing a lot of little clapping that we can't hear. Um, but yeah, thank you so kindly for joining me. Today, my presentation is called El Jardin, and it's all about newcomers in the community garden space. I'd like to begin by briefly introducing myself and my experiences with both gardens and being a newcomer here in Canada. So, as Helen mentioned, my name is Manny Vazquez. I have been involved in community gardens for a little over a decade now, which is a bit um, jarring for me because it shows that time passes, time moves forward. But I started when I was 16. I went to a very special school called Environmental Charter High School in Los Angeles, which is where I'm from. Um, and I was able to volunteer in community gardens with the Los Angeles Community Garden Council at the time. I learned a lot about sustainable horticulture. Specifically, composting was a really big push at the time, and soil remediation. I would later go on to study a different topic, anthropology, for a while. Still passionate about anthropology and human interests, which is sort of where this presentation is kind of going to lead us into, sort of an anthropological view of community gardens. But then I found my way back into the community garden space by working with environmental charter schools for a few years as a environmental science coordinator. I worked with students to tend both school gardens and to do outreach programs with community gardens and continue to foster that knowledge with the master gardeners in Los Angeles, eventually finding my way over here to Ontario about 5 years ago and finding my way to the Halton Environmental Network, where I became an education coordinator and worked in the community gardens here in Halton. A bit of a learning experience coming from the eco zone in Los Angeles, so the eco zone here in the Burlington area, which is where I do most of my work. But it was cool, which kind of segues into the whole idea of newcomers and immigrants. My experience being a newcomer is that I moved here 5 years ago, but I'm also the child of immigrants, and I've been raised around immigrants of Latin American origins and other origins. Los Angeles is a very ethnically diverse area for my entire life. So I've been able to hear experiences that differ from person to person, but there tends to be some similarities in the experience of newcomers where there's um, a challenge to overcome, and we'll talk about that briefly in this presentation, the challenges of newcomers. But I suppose we should begin. And I'd like to begin with the idea of Canada as a country of diverse foods. So there you'll see a picture of a bunch of food that I helped grow in the community garden spaces here in the Burlington area. We have some really special crops and some really big Canadian staples and some things that are a bit rare. Nostrum is one that maybe isn't cultivated as much as a crop that's edible, but it is. Typically, we kind of see it as a weed because it grows so aggressively. But some of those are things that I think we're a little bit more familiar with: our eggplants, our cauliflowers, our gourds, and our tomatoes. And these are all crops that are only really possible because of how culturally diverse Canada is and how culturally diverse the whole world is. Truly, we live in a really globalized community nowadays. And many of these crops find their origins outside of North America, outside of Canada. And I find that typically we as gardeners don't really explore that sort of history and that sort of his, that sort of archaeological lineage. But I'd like to do that today to begin the presentation. I'd like to get us thinking about how some of these foods came from South Asia, East Asia, Latin America, and the Mediterranean. And to get us started with that, I'd like to take a few moments to just look at some images. So there we have tomatoes, some of them ripening, some of them ripe. And I'd like you to take a moment in the chat to just write down some guesses of where you think tomatoes are from. Some of you may already know the origins of tomatoes, but if you don't, please feel free to guess. If you do, feel free to mention the answer in the chat box as well. I'll give you guys a few seconds to do that, and then I'd like to get into talking about that a little bit more. And then I don't actually know if I can see that. I can see the chat box. Helen Marley. Hello, Helen. All right. All right. I am happy to see that the answer is pretty much accurate there. Tomatoes are from South America. Um, South America, the Andes, yeah. Oh, sorry. Gonna go back one. Nope, South America, the Andes. As far north as I think central Mexico as well, but that's exactly where they're from. They were cultivated by indigenous people for a long time. I'm glad to see that, and I'm glad to see that no one was thrown. I feel like I'm going to be talking to a lot of knowledgeable people right now. Let's go on to the next one. We're looking at carrots now. Again, these are all pictures from the garden, so not perfect, but I think they're kind of pretty. And looking at some answers for where we think carrots are from. I love these little interactive segments. It's always fun to get the audience engaged with these kind of questionnaires. It's like trivia, and I feel like all of us as garden people just get kind of excited about it. I'm seeing a lot of good answers here. The Iran area is pretty accurate, actually. So it's not a perfect science tracing back historical paleobotany. But in general, we can get some estimations from the research that's out there. Iran seems to be the leading guess, or the leading answer for where carrots originated from. They wouldn't have had this coloring before cultivation. They would have been closer to a white root, as a lot of other root vegetables are, but they were cultivated throughout thousands of years in those areas, just as many other crops are cultivated for taste, size, ability to prosper in certain climates. And so that's when we get carrots. So for all of you who guessed Iran, I'm guessing you all already knew that, because it's a very specific answer there. And I'm glad to see that. Next one, just one more. We have the eggplant, or as I like to say, aubergine. Just think it's a fun word. Some guesses as to where eggplants are from. And this one, you might be able to guess via just the culinary uses for it, if you're familiar with the food that's used very often. Although it's, again, we live in a globalized world, so there are a lot of different culinary genres that use eggplants in their cooking, just as there are a lot of culinary worlds that use tomatoes and carrots. It's sort of difficult to tell based off of just that, but if you're really familiar with this genre of food, you might have guessed it. All right, so for answers for this one, I'm seeing India, Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and India. Really good. So when I think of tomatoes and I think of aubergines, I think of Italian cooking a lot, which is not the case. They didn't originate there, especially tomatoes. They came from Latin America, or from what is now Latin America, and eggplants originated a little bit further south in the India area. If you're familiar with Indian food, you'll know that's used in a lot of different curries and a lot of traditional cooking there. If you're not so familiar with Indian food, you'll be more familiarized with eggplants in Italian cooking or European cooking. All right, so that kind of segues really nicely into this idea of the globalized world and other cultural practices that we have in this globalized world that we don't think about being from a specific area. We don't think of eggplants being from India. We don't think of tomatoes being from South America. Typically, we just think of them as being part of like the Canadian experience, or even potentially the European experience in some cases, where they've been there for thousands, hundreds of years now. But they are a product of immigration. They are a product of moving through the world. And Canada itself is a product of immigration. Canada is a country of immigrants. That segues into this slide, where we talk a little bit about just the population trends in Canada. As of 2021 census, we've hit record highs in regards to the immigrant population. A few decades prior to that, it looked like a fifth of the population of Canada was immigrants. Now it's roughly a quarter. The same research or the census team showed that there's very strong reason to believe that by 2040, the Canadian population will be closer to 1/3 immigrants, which is kind of exciting because I find that the more we have immigration in different places and the more we have a globalized world, the more we get to experience different cultures and different parts. I mean, I personally love tomatoes and eggplants and carrots. It's part of the reason I featured those there. And we wouldn't have been able to have those experiences of combining those foods or having those foods in certain dishes without immigration and without this globalized world. Another interesting thing to look at there is the trends in terms of visible minorities. So the 2021 census shows that the largest ethnic populations arriving to Canada as new immigrants are Indian and Filipino. This is actually different than a few decades back, where the larger the immigrants coming to Canada were from the United States or from the United Kingdom, where there's more of a shared cultural experience. So that provides some difficulties for immigrants coming into the country, but it also provides some really great chances for us to grow as a country and to become more diverse in our cultural practices. These trends are mirrored in the Halton region to some extent, and there's a lot of people writing really cool things about that, both within the Halton region and just out of it. So I touched upon the idea that newcomers in Canada have challenges, and so I'd like to talk about those briefly. When we think of, at least from my experience, when we think of the most pertinent challenge for any newcomer in any country, it comes down to employment opportunities. You find yourself in a new country and you're not familiar with the same professional network you might have had. Your job experience might not translate. You might not even know the language, but the most pressing thing is being able to find employment so that you can support yourself and your family potentially. And then we also have the fact that in recent year, trends of inflation and lack of affordable housing have affected all of Canada. But again, if you don't have a strong network already in place, and if you don't have those employment opportunities or you have a language barrier, it can be even more pressing for newcomers in Canada. It's sort of a difficult time to be a newcomer with all of those trends happening right now. And I'm sure we've all felt it, both with the housing market, the rent market, and with just going to the grocery store sometimes. The price for produce has become incredibly expensive, which is which makes it very difficult to eat healthy and to sort of build a life in which you have the best foot moving forward for yourself and for potentially your children. And then finally, a challenge for newcomers, which there are many, but one that I think is also as equally pertinent, but in a different landscape, more of a mental health landscape than a physical health landscape or a physical security landscape, is the lack of cultural connection. It's often cited by newcomers as a huge challenge. You find that things are very different in this country, especially if you come from somewhere like Latin America or from South Asia or from East Asia or anywhere that doesn't have a strong shared cultural experience, such as the United States, the UK, and Canada. Coming from the United States, I didn't have a huge transition period in Canada. I found that a lot of things were largely the same, but I know that my parents had struggles coming from Mexico to the United States because things were ever so slightly different there. One of those challenges being language, but also one of those being food. You tend to really enjoy the food that you grew up with, and sometimes you get experimental and expand your worldview and get a real strong taste for other foods. I personally didn't grow up eating Indian food, but I love it now. It's probably one of my top 3 favorite food genres. And I find that happens for a lot of folks. But I also find that you always sort of miss that little bit of food that you had back home. I know I still miss really good Mexican food and really good food that's sort of like Tex-Mex or like Los Angeles American influence. We had we get that fusion of American and Mexican culinary delights that you can't find as much here in this part of Ontario. At least where I live, live in rural Ontario. To be fair, maybe if I lived closer to Toronto, it'd be a little bit easier to have access to that. But even then, it's not exactly the same. And for people who have grown up their entire lives in areas such as Mexico and India, it's really limiting not being able to find certain culinary dishes. And sometimes that's because we don't have access to the crops used in those culinary dishes. So what do we do? My solution, and the solution of some other folks, is that we put newcomers into the community garden spaces. This helps address that final point that I was making about the mental health perspective, where we talked about newcomers and missing certain cultural delights. But it also helps with the physical aspect of thing. It directly affects food security. It responds to that issue by being able to grow your own food for a fraction of the cost of being able to pick up that produce in the market. Seeds are cheaper than crops typically. And we see that. We see a lot of community garden spaces being used by folks of lower income or socioeconomic struggles. And so there's that aspect of it. There's also the physical aspect of it in terms of physical health, where we think about the fact that when it comes to the produce in the markets, it might not be of the highest level of nutritional value. Typically we find, or flavor even, typically we find that the crops that are grown for commercial use are grown more for shelf stability than for anything else. But when we're able to grow our own crops, we can sort of choose and pick what we want our crops to be for. We can tailor them to our taste and to our needs. And as anybody who's ever been in a garden will know, you can really break up a sweat just working in a garden for a few hours a day, which is great for your physical health, your cardiovascular system. It's something that addresses all of those issues for newcomers and for anybody really. But a less commonly talked about thing when it comes to garden spaces is the ability to access food with a strong cultural or familial connection. It's that concept of being able to grow an heirloom tomato that potentially your great grandmother has been collecting seeds from and passed on to your grandmother and passed on to your mother and passed on to you. There's that. And then there's the fact that we can grow crops that may have never been grown in this area before. Tomatoes weren't grown in Europe before the discovery of the New World or before colonization. And now we have varieties of tomatoes that were cultivated in that part of the world that were never cultivated in the New World. So that's a very interesting thing to see there. And we can still do that with other crops, even if it poses different challenges. Crops that maybe we're not so familiar with, crops that we'll talk about. Before we get into that, I would like to just quickly address that while doing research for this presentation, I stumbled upon this amazing program based out of Guelph. It's called Food from Home equals Food for Home. And essentially, they had the exact same thought process that I did, that community garden spaces are used by newcomers in Canada very often because of a lack of food security, because of a longing for that cultural connection, and because food tends to be something of a universal language. We all like some of the crops that are staples all around the world. You know, your grains. We all are familiar with tomatoes now because they've been used so often in citrus fruit, which doesn't grow great here in Canada, unfortunately. I do miss that. But is used in culinary dishes all around the world. And so what Food from Home did was they saw this and they decided that they wanted to support it. They wanted to support newcomers in community garden spaces. They did this by looking at the federal government to support them in efforts to support newcomers, and were able to get funding to train 10 to 15 urban gardeners in community garden spaces around Guelph. They aimed at specifically getting newcomers into these community garden spaces because of all the reasons that I mentioned, but also because of all of the things that they could bring to the garden space, traditional knowledge from areas that aren't Canada, knowledge about crops that maybe we've never tried here in Canada, but I think we should try because, they might do well here and they might taste great and they might be a great addition to the cultural melting pot. And so what I want to do is I want to go ahead and highlight just 6 crops that I think can do that. I think can be a great addition to the Canadian garden. And I'd like to start close to home. Again, I'm Latin American. I have Latin American heritage. I grew up around a lot of American people. And in my own community garden spaces, I found that we were growing a lot of food from Mexico and South America that wasn't traditionally grown commercially here at the time, the United States, and now I would say here in Canada. And so the first crop that I wanted to go ahead and recognize was Papalo. There's the line name there. I'm going to butcher it, so I will not even try to pronounce that. But that is Papalo. That is a crop that I've actually grown up eating my entire life. And I'm really excited to talk about these first 2 because I'm the most familiar with them. And I'm really excited to talk about the next 4 after that because I'm not as familiar with them. I didn't grow up eating them, but I'd like to learn more about them. And in the process of doing research for this presentation, I learned more about them. So Papalo is native to a range of Mexico as far as, I believe, northern Mexico to Southern America. It's part of the Astraceae family, prefers hot and dry climate, well-drained soil. Harvest is needed, self-sowing. Taste is described as a mix of cilantro and arugula. I would argue that I don't really taste the arugula as much. I personally argue that for me, Papalo has always tasted like super cilantro. It's like you took cilantro and just condensed it into pure cilantro flavor, which already I know for some of you is not your thing. Some of you it might be, but I know that cilantro is a bit of a controversial plant in our garden spaces. I know that some people are just not a fan, and that's totally fine. It's actually a thing in Mexico, apparently, that a good portion of the population is not a fan of Papalo, but for those who love it, they love it. It's a staple. It, we find that cilantro is actually used often as a substitute for this particular herb in Mexican dishes because we can't find papalo as easily and readily as we can find cilantro, which is not originally from Mexico, but instead is originally from the Asian continent. And so the most common culinary uses here is salsas. I actually grew up eating it not in salsas, but I ended up eating it more in specialized sandwich. My family is originally from the state of Puebla, and in the state of Puebla, we have something called semitas, which are these special sandwiches that use this sort of shredded white soft cheese that doesn't have too much flavor to it, a little bit of a sour hint to it, maybe. Your chipotles that are marinated in a sauce, and papalo. That's what goes inside. The rest of it is a specific type of bread made specifically for semitas. And that is, or was, it's hard to say your taste changed so much, but it was for a long time my favorite sandwich of all time. It was amazing. It was great. The papalo really just added so much to the flavor. And a little goes a long way, which is great. Talking about the food there a little bit much. Let's talk about the crop itself, about growing it. So hot and dry climates, well-draining soil. This crop would grow well. I believe it was in USDA hardy zones 6 and above. So we just hit the range here in Burlington, I believe. It's hard with the USDA hardiness zones as opposed to the ones that we use in Canada, but they tend to translate decently well. It can be grown here. It's from a hot and dry climate, so it doesn't love winter, but it will grow in about 2 to 3 months. And then it'll continue growing, and you can harvest as needed. That's sort of the big thing there. You want to get into the ground after any chance of first frost, and truthfully, you'll hear that a lot with the crops that I'm going to be talking about for the next couple of minutes. You can't really grow these during the winter, unfortunately, or during the fall, really. You have to wait until the last frost is over, and you have to plant them outside, keep them hot, so they can germinate well. You could start them indoors as well, and we'll talk about that a little bit more with some other crops, but with the rate that Papalo grows, you won't have really problems planting after the first frost and then harvesting in 2 months and then continuing to harvest in 3 months and then harvesting all the way up until probably the end of fall. It'll probably last you until the first frost there. It's a pretty resilient one as far as the plants I'm talking about today go. And then the next one is tomatillos. Tomatillos are also native to the range of Mexico all the way to Central America. They're part of the Salancia family, prefer areas with full sun and loamy soil. And I'll make a note there too that when I say loamy soil, they also enjoy being well drained. All of these crops will enjoy a well drained soil. They don't want to be too wet, and they do want to be really hot. But obviously, well, not obviously, some plants are very, very tolerant of full sun. On the hottest of hot days, they might be damaged a little bit, but in this particular case, full sun will work just fine. Maybe the slightest bit of shade if you have the perfect spot like that. 2 to 3 months to harvest. They can potentially self-sow, typically require a partner plant to produce the fruit. So you're going to want to grow more than just one. It's not a question, which I will look at real quick. Oh, not a question, just a comment about tomatillos. They do make a great green salsa. They do. Sometimes people use green tomatoes, but it's not the same. It doesn't taste anywhere near the same. They're, again, I kind of just describe them as like a super green tomato because they have so much more, not so much more, but such a distinct flavor to them. It's very potent. The most common culinary use, as mentioned just now, is in salsas. When you see your traditional Mexican green salsas, this is what's used, tomatillos. And if you want to get really traditional, you'll also see papalo used in that. But we'll talk about that in a second. Let's talk about the plant first. We also call them husk tomatoes sometimes. You might hear that name around. Mexican green tomatoes. Tomatillos literally translates to small tomato in Spanish. They've been cultivated in the area of central Mexico since the Nahua people who made up what is known as the Triple Alliance or the Aztec Alliance. They were cultivated by those people, by those indigenous groups for a long time. They have an incredible amount of nutrients and vitamins within them. They're very rich. I think it's something like 10 times the amount of vitamin C as a tomato. So it's something cool like that. And the flavor isn't as sweet. It's sort of more sour. It's, again, think of a green tomato, but a little bit of sourness to it, a little bit more kick to it is the best way to describe it. And it's great. It's also, I would argue, as easy to grow as a tomato. I don't know, maybe some of you folks have had struggles with tomatoes in the past, but I've always found tomatoes to be sort of one of the more, in the right area, the more consistent crops for me. They'll have problems every once in a while, but they'll also grow. And provided the right amount of sun, the right amount of water, they'll grow plentiful. The same is true with tomatillos. I'd like to, again, though, bring focus to the fact that it requires a partner plant to produce fruit. Some people have found that certain tomatillos can produce just by themselves, but I would plant at least 6 of these together to get that nice little variety there. And then I'd like to highlight Salsa Verde or green salsa, this case with Papalo. So I mentioned briefly that Papalo is substituted very often in Mexican cooking by cilantro. And so when you see a traditional salsa verde, you'll typically get cilantro because that's what's most plentifully available. Papalo isn't available nearly as often in North America outside of Mexico, and even in Mexico isn't as popular as cilantro because cilantro has just become such a popular crop in the area. So this recipe, you can follow along with it. I'm not going to talk about it too much. It's one that I found online. They actually wrote a really great article included in their website, included in their recipe about tomatillos, and Papalo, or no, sorry, about Papalo specifically, not Tomatillos as much, and how you can't beat it, and how it's an undeniable flavor. And so, either by finding these items at a land grocery store or a specialty grocery store, or taking the chance and growing them in your own garden this year, I would highly recommend following this recipe, trying these crops, trying these foods, and seeing if you like them in your garden space and if you like them in your kitchen as well. And so, just gonna quickly address the chat there. Thank you. And so I'm gonna move to an area that I'm a little bit less familiar with, but I'm very excited to talk about because I did a lot of research for this presentation. I'm going to move towards the Indian subcontinent, or the area of India. And we're going to talk about some crops from there. Now, this is one that we might be a little bit more familiar with in our spice racks, turmeric. And it's part of the ginger family. It's native to India, prefers areas with full sun and well-drained soil. I'm going to skip over that real quick, but or just glance it over, but it should be grown in containers as they're not very as they're not very cold tolerant plants. And they take 9 to 10 months to harvest. So this is going to be sort of one of those crops that you really have to foster for a while. They're grown by rhizome divisions. You can see in the photo there, those little rhizomes, they can be split apart, and then you can grow more turmeric out of those. Taste is described as earthy and bitter. Now, admittedly, I've never had the roots of turmeric outside of powdered form, and I've never had the leaves. But I'm curious, and I find that I use turmeric a lot in my cooking. The most common culinary uses in curries. In your traditional curry powder, you'll find that turmeric is actually about a quarter of what consists of curry powder. You have a lot of things in there, but turmeric is a big one. It gives it that really brilliant coloring of a sort of yellow shine, sometimes close to orangish in my opinion. And so turmeric seems like a challenge. It seems impossible. I was able to read a really fun article by a gardener back down in the States that talked about growing ginger and talked about growing turmeric and their struggles with it, and the fact that when people hear that they grew fresh turmeric or that they have fresh turmeric available to them, they're like, how did you do it? Like, how could you do that? We get frost. It takes so long. How could we possibly harvest that? And the secret was container gardening. So for those of you who are familiar with container gardening, which I think would be a good chunk of you, it's just the idea of growing your plants in containers. Your traditional 2-liter black containers are great for this kind of thing. You could go bigger. I wouldn't go smaller with this sort of crop, but essentially you'd grow it in the same way you'd grow a houseplant for a while. In this particular case, you take these rhizomes, which you could find in specialty produce markets as sort of fresh, ungraded turmeric, and you could plant them into the ground. Fun story. You could plant them into the ground, and you could have them come up when it gets warm enough. It would take a long, long time, 9 to 10 months, but once it starts getting a little bit warmer still, once the last chance of frost is passed, you'd be able to take them outside, and they should do well in the hot Canadian summer. I would bring them inside if they are not ready to harvest by fall, and we would grow them as annuals, essentially. Reading through the chats because I'm trying to keep engaged there. Tried to grow turmeric last year, produced lots of leaves, but not the roots. Yes, it needs a long season. It was directly in the ground, though. That's interesting. So yes, from what I've read, a lot of people don't recommend doing directly in the ground. A lot of people recommend that potting method because you can grow them inside to extend that beginning life. You will need grow lights for this, and potentially heating pad as well, because we wouldn't get sufficient sun during the winter time. But you can do that, get them started, put them outside for as long as possible until we start to get that colder weather. And once you start to see them struggle a bit with that colder weather, and you can bring them back inside and extend that harvest season. I would even argue that because they are perennial in most of the world, you could grow them similar to houseplants, in that most houseplants that we have are from tropical regions of the world, and they survive because our homes mimic that, because we prefer that climate for ourselves. And so you could potentially grow turmeric as a houseplant and sort of continue to harvest the leaves or even the roots by pulling them up and then doing cuttings. But again, you need a pot. You need them to be mobile because unfortunately they cannot withstand the harsh Canadian winters or even the cooler weather that we get in fall. The same can be said about ginger, by the way. You wouldn't think that we could grow ginger in Canada. We can do it the same way with container pots. Sort of just have to adapt to be able to try these things fresh, because I think as gardeners, we can all agree that fresh is a little bit better. All right, this next one is Malabar spinach. Now, this is one that I hadn't heard about before at all, so it's entirely new to me. And I really want to try it as well because it's gonna skip down to the taste there. It's described as a similar taste to common commercial spinach, but with a hint of pepper, a peppery taste to it. And that sounds absolutely enticing to me. It's native to the range of India to New Guinea. It's part of the Basella family, prefers areas with full sun and well-drained soil, which again, you'll see that commonly. This one has fortunately much shorter harvest period, time to harvest than turmeric. This can be grown in 2 to 3 months. And actually is really great because we can grow this outside of the season that we grow spinach. So spinach we'd grow when it's a little bit cooler. Those hot summer months might not be perfect for spinach, but it would be perfect for Malabar spinach. So if you have a big love for spinach, amazing. Glad to hear that. We've had some people who have grown Malabar spinach before and have had great success in our area. So it shows that it can be done. And I'd argue it shows that it should be done. And so again, we can grow this just outside of that time when we'd be able to grow spinach so that we can have spinach all throughout the season. Malabar spinach in the summer, fresh commercial spinach in the fall. And then unfortunately, we also hear that we've had some struggles growing Malabar spinach in our community gardens here in Halton. It's hit or miss. All crops have some challenges, but I think we can adapt to them with the right information. Oop, didn't mean to go backwards. And really the secret here is just get it out after the last chance of frost has passed. All of these crops are not acclimated to the cold. We can also start this indoors, and potentially that'll give us a little bit better of a chance to extend that harvest season and to get a strong base for it. With growing indoors, I do recommend grow lights and heating pads if possible. If not, just as much sun as possible and as much warmth as possible. Common culinary uses for this, I didn't mention that for turmeric either. Common culinary use for turmeric was curry. Here with Malabar spinach, we have a little bit more options. We have salads. You can use it as an extension of regular spinach. But you also have curries, which spinach is used in curries as well, stir fries, and you can even just sort of snack on it its own. It's a leafy green, so it's tasty in that way. And I'm going to go ahead and talk about the next recipe there, curry, one of my favorite things in the world. Malabar spinach curry. This is another great recipe that I found online. I am not very familiar with cooking Indian food. Very familiar with eating it, enjoy it thoroughly, but not as familiar with cooking it. So it was a great learning experience to look at this recipe and sort of try to figure out what that meant, what some of these ingredients meant, because some of them are also not as common. So like your split red gram, aka your dal, those would be your sort of dried legumes. So you could think of them sort of in the same way that you think of like split peas and stuff like that. And so this particular recipe calls for split red gram. You could try a different legume, a dried legume in place of it. You could try a lentil, a yellow lentil, as a suggestion. And then your ground masala, which a masala would be a mixture of different ground up spices. And you either do a dry masala or you do a wet masala. And then you sort of incorporate that into the curry. It's sort of like the base, sort of like instead of using a stock for a soup, you would use a masala for a curry, is my understanding of it. And so man, just looking at that makes me super intrigued in growing those things and trying fresh turmeric and keep going back and forth. Sorry about that, folks. Technical difficulties, unfortunately. But yeah, that's recipe down there. I hope you all take a chance to screenshot it or look back on this video and try to follow up on that recipe. And try it yourself at home, either with food that you find in commercial or specialty grocery stores, or try growing it yourself this summer, because as I've said, fresher is typically better. Gonna answer that chat. Oh, that's exciting. There are seeds for red Malabar in the Royal Botanical Garden seed library. That is very exciting. And a note from Helen, this video is being recorded and will be available on our website, as well as the Hen YouTube channel. Very exciting. You get to all see my technical difficulties in the future. So let's move on, though, into a different part of the world. Not so different, though. We're talking about bitter melon now. And when looking at bitter melon, I actually got to find that there was a little bit of contention to the origin of bitter melon, which makes sense. Again, with paleobotany, it's not a perfect science. There is more that you, with any science, it's not a perfect science. You learn more as you do more research. And so in this particular case, it was long thought that bitter melon originated in India and was cultivated there. But new research shows, as recent as 2020 actually, that bitter melon would have first found its way into the world cultivated in North Africa, and then moved its way into India and other parts of the world. It's very popular. You also might hear this called bitter gourd. It's part of the cucumber family, or the gourd family, sorry. And it looks like it. But unlike your gourds, like your sweeter melons or even your squashes, this would have a distinctly bitter taste. I was trying to find fun ways to describe all of the foods that we've talked about recently. So like with Papalo, how I described it as super cilantro, or Tomatillos as super green tomatoes. Bitter melon, all I found online was just, it's bitter, which was a fun thing to say. So yeah, taste is described as bitter. It harvests in about 2 to 3 months, can be grown as an annual, and will be most productive in the warmest season. Its common culinary uses include salads, curries, and stir fries. So again, this food ended up migrating its way into India and into other parts of Asia. In Eastern Asia, it's more traditionally used as something to include in stir fries, and in Indian cooking, it would be more traditionally used in curries. It grows in the same way that a lot of other gourds grow. They vine off, and then you have this guy popping out of there. So I would typically find that we have the same problems that we have with other gourds. Although I'll point out that because of where it was acclimated to, this actually tends to love high humidity, where we'll have a little bit of problem with something like powdery mildew with other gourds. And next, we're talking about okra. This is one we might be a little bit more familiar with, especially if we've ever delved into the United States South, the southern parts of the United States. And I'll get into that briefly, but it's native to Northern Africa and India. That's a typo. It's native to Western Africa and India. Again, there's a huge range. Paleobotany is not perfect, and so you have new information being discovered all the time. But the general consensus is that Western Africa is where okra originated from and was cultivated. It's part of the mallow family. It prefers an area with full sun and well-draining soil. You can harvest it in 2 to 3 months, grown from seeds, but it's best to start indoors, as with many of these other crops. Its taste is described as sweet and grassy. Now, believe it or not, despite being from the United States, I've never actually had okra myself. But I have heard of okra, both in my time in the United States and in my time here in Canada. I've had it grown in the community gardens that I work at, and just never had the opportunity. So in the United States, it sort of has the context that is a little bit difficult to talk about, but should be addressed. It came to the United States at the same time as the transatlantic slave business came to the United States. It was brought into the country, into this continent, because of slavery, and it was well adapted. Because of that, we actually hear some of the common names for okra in the South as something like gumbo, which is associated with the African American population in the South. And it's also associated with all of that culinary world as well. But it's here now, and it grows. It's grown in the South for a long time, and it can be grown here as far north as Southern Ontario, and potentially even further north if we maximize our time indoors and we maximize the summers that we have. The common culinary uses include soups, salads, and stir fries. And talking about stir fries, we'll go ahead and talk about bitter melon and okra stir fry as the final thing. I'm going to look at the chat again. And people are talking about the beautiful flowers of okra. Yes, I've heard a lot of people actually say that they grow okra for the flowers because it's just, they're so pretty. But I'm always of the mind that growing anything for food is better. Nasturtium, any edible flower, I care less about the aesthetics and more about the practicality. That is me personally, though. Yep. The sticky component, so we see the comments here we see the chat here talking about okra being used in West Indian cooking, the sticky component, so it's often used as a binding agent. That sort of comes into play with the idea of in the American South, it's used, or it's sometimes called gumbo. It has that sort of sticky inside, and gumbo being a sort of a thicker soup used in that part of the world would very much be used in the same way there. That traditional meal in Barbados is called kokoko. So interesting. So bitter melons are, again, part of the gourd family. They're bitter gourds. Going back a few, this is what they would look like. And so the best I could find about bitter melons is that they taste bitter. They have a strong bitter flavor. I can't tell you much more about their... Oh, no, it's all right. I can't tell you much more about the lineage of it before that, but they're just sort of a bitter taste. A lot of people say that they find that it really brings out the flavor in other things, which makes sense. You eat them cooked with salt and other flavors, and it sort of makes a sort of cohesiveness that you wouldn't have otherwise. There are other bitter foods that we like, such as sometimes certain hot peppers, or even peppers themselves if you don't get the sweeter varieties. So I'd be really curious to try it myself. I haven't tried bitter melons nor okra, but I'd like to. And so this is a recipe for stir fry that I found on another website. The recipe is shared with you all, and I hope that you all have access to it. And that you all follow up with this. These are just 6 crops that I wanted to highlight from different parts of the world. That pretty much concludes everything that I had to say about it. If there are any questions, I'd love to keep talking. I really love how engaged the chat is. Thank you all so much for joining me, and please continue to ask me questions.
Thank you, Manny. That was great. It's a lot of informative, a lot of information on a lot of different vegetables. Some I've heard of, some I have not. Yeah, so put your questions in either the Q&A function at the very bottom or in the chat, as people have been doing. Share anything that you have grown, which is not the usual suspects that people grow up in Ontario. So
Yes.
Share what you've been growing and hear your stories, for sure.
Yeah, no, I, again, was very excited about this presentation. It took everything in me not to just talk about Latin American crops, because I want to talk about all of them. I want to talk about prickly pear cactus, which we can grow as an indoor plant. And I'm going to go ahead and smuggle that all in here now because I still want to talk about it. Eastern prickly pear, endangered species here in Ontario, can still be grown and can be safely harvested, both for the pads and for the fruit. So that might be something you want to look at if you're ever at a specialty nursery growing prickly pear, because they can be grown outside. That's the Eastern prickly pear. Still edible pads. Add loofah to the list of crops. That's true. That is another crop that isn't traditionally grown commercially. That'd be a good one.
I've actually wanted to try that for exactly that purpose, for scrubbing.
Yeah, no, same. I saw it a few years ago and was very interested. Still talking about Latin American crops, some other specialty peppers, and you get chayote, which is another gourd that doesn't have such a bitter taste, but is more of what you think of your traditional gourds, where it has that sort of savory flavor almost. I don't know how to describe gourds really. I'm bad at that. Sweet is really kind of more what it is, honestly, but not a traditional sweetness. But yeah, no, I also really want to push prickly pear as much as possible because we get it growing.
Yeah.
Oh
Maybe
yeah,
another session.
that'd be great. I'd be happy to talk about these plants again, and I'd be happy to encourage us all to sort of go outside the mold and grow some things that we haven't seen in Canada before, because it just makes it that much more exciting to look at people's gardens.
Absolutely. When Manny and I were speaking about what he was going to present for this Halton Garden Week, I was telling him about a restaurant I went to where the chef, I guess, really likes to explore and try new things. And he was growing a corn that had traditionally only been grown in South America. It had never been grown as far north as Ontario. Gave it a go and was able to make the flour tortillas from that corn. And it was just so, I think you were able to name the corn though, weren't you, Manny, when we spoke, that you thought it might be?
What was it the traditional like blue corn?
I don't, it's just, I can't, oh, now you're pressing me to remember. I don't remember, but I do know that he said it had never been grown this far north and they were able to successfully grow it, which does say a little something about climate change, but
Mhm.
so it's great that, we can try these new things up here.
That's true. Yeah, no, from that's something that I thought about sort of after the fact, but because the focus of this presentation was so much on sort of like a sociological, anthropological perspective of newcomers in community garden spaces. I didn't want to get too bogged down in science, but a few years ago, I did a session with the forestry and conservation authorities to become a certified seed collector. And at the time, one of the most pressing things was the climate change and was the effects of climate change and how much warmer the growing seasons are and how much longer they're getting. So it's also a thing where a lot of things that we couldn't traditionally grow here in Canada will eventually be able to be grown here potentially.
Mhm.
Um, so that's both. It's scary, but also interesting. And then yeah, no, I'm hearing about so many cool things. Yukon and Oka, but they are roots to come by both of South American.
Yeah,
Oh, okay.
yeah.
Elephant ears. Yeah, I know yucca is another great yucca you do grow here sometimes, and they grow it as an annual, but that's one that has an edible root. And so it kind of tastes like potato, but even starchier if you can believe it. I love yucca though. And sometimes it's pronounced yucca here.
And what
But
would
yeah.
you have that in a stew? Or what would you do with that then with this?
Yeah, you could have it in a you could have it in a stew. The best way I've ever had yucca is the same way that I've the best my personal opinion for the best way to have potatoes, which is in the form of a fry. You fry it up and eat it for all its starchy goodness. Maybe have a little dip in sauce.
Hmm.
But yes, no, thank you all so kindly. I'd love to see that you all also have ideas of what else can be grown. It's it's very exciting. It's a very exciting time to be a gardener because I find that we have more access to these specialty items as well. I managed to grow Papalo once in a community garden and haven't had the chance to again yet, but maybe this is the year.
So thank you once again to Manny, but before everybody leaves us, two things. One, we do have an upcoming speaker at 4 p.m. who's going to talk about invasive species in the garden. I think a very informative and timely topic as we talk about climate change and things that are surviving a little bit longer and able to survive in these warmer temperatures up in Ontario, that our invasive species are not dying off with our winter weather because it's not as cold as usual. So that would be a great talk. So join us at 4 p.m. for that. And thank you to one of our sponsors. There is a giveaway at this talk. So as everybody came in, I assigned you a number and I have a random number generator. And if I could just share the screen, I'm going to show you. Sorry, I'm just going to kick you
Yep.
out there,
There we
Manny.
go.
There we go. Yes, do you see the vertical herb and flower garden and the vertical fruit and veg garden? Do we see that? That is, the person here today was going to win a vertical herb and flower garden kit. It comes with 12 small pots, ideal for growing a variety of herbs and vegetables. It will come with supports to screw it into a wall, fence, or shed, and it comes with its own drippers and tap connector, so you connect it directly to a tap or timer. And this is courtesy of Irrigatia. So, as I said, I assigned everybody a number, and I'm going to press the app for the number generator. And it is 14, and 14 belongs to Emma. So, Emma M, please contact us at info@haltonenvironment.ca to claim your prize, and we will have that shipped out to you. So, Emma M, if you're still with us, just give us something in the little chat to say you're still with us, and you'll send us your contact. Oh, there you go. Well, thanks. And I will write the email address there, contact info@haltonenvironment.ca, and we will be able to ship out your prize to you. So congratulations to Emma. And once again, thank you so much to Manny. We really, really appreciate this talk. It was fun. It was a nice, fun talk, actually. Yeah.
No, thank you all so much. You all also made it very fun. I love how engaged everyone is and how excited they are to go out there and garden. So thank you all.
Absolutely. All right. Thanks very much, everybody. And we will see you at 4 p.m.